Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of the Sunday Stream. And joining me again on the channel is the wonderful and deeply knowledgeable Praise of Folly. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
I'm glad that you're here. It's always a great time when I get to chat with you. So, today we get to talk about a subject that you've covered before, which makes it even better to talk about him today. But we'll be talking about, Alfred Thayer Mahan and his influence that he's made in his fantastic work in 1890. So, we'll be talking about him, naval strategy, history, the applications, modern stuff. It'll be all over the place. It'll be a really good hour or so in conversation. Where did you want to start, Praise? Because there's so many places that we could begin.
I think where I'd like to start is at least providing a context for historical strategy and a sort of place to hang events throughout history. So the first question is, why is it that we had to wait until 1890 to get a bona fide strategic treatise on naval warfare? So going back to like Sun Tzu's The Art of War, or various classical Greek texts on war, most military treatises on war had to do with either the formation of armies or sieges, so land combat. If naval warfare was treated at all, it was either as an appendix or a footnote to these other treatises. Now, I think one reason is if we look at the fact that the Earth is covered 71% in water, prior to the age of sail, most of that water was inaccessible because it was deep water and you had to basically engage in, to the extent you did engage in naval operations, they were the result of coastal littoral regions. So you would see a lot in the Mediterranean. You'd see some along the southern coast of China with like pirates. You'd also see some around the Indian coast and around the coast of the Horn of Africa. Now, what we have with the Columbian Age, which we already discussed with regards to geostrategy and Mackinder, is the idea that now we have blue water navies that can operate in more or less any direction and can go across the world. Now that begins with sail and culminates in the modern age with nuclear power. So I think what's helpful to sort of organize the way we think about naval strategy is we can divide it in naval warfare in general, is we can divide it into two broad categories. The first category is what I call dependent naval operations, and so that begins from 1179 BC, the Battle of the Delta between Ramesses III and the Sea Peoples, and 1571 AD at the Battle of Lepanto. And what I mean by dependent is these naval operations are dependent upon land operations. They are supporting dependent operations. And then beginning with the Columbian Age, so this coincides again with Mackinder, we have what I call the age of independent operations, beginning in 1492, the age of sail and coal and now nuclear power, up to the present, where naval operations can be engaged for their own sake. So a good example of a dependent naval operation would be Scipio's siege of Utica. There were Roman ships, and they were used to blockade the Carthaginian city of Utica as a part of a combined operations on the city. Whereas the Dutch, French, and British pirates, or English pirates, who assailed the Spanish Main were pursuing independent naval operations. So their goal was to degrade Spanish naval power as such, not to achieve some supportive land role. So I think if we look at that, we have two broad categories of analyzing history. And then I would say, furthermore, there's 5 basic roles within naval warfare. We have littoral operations. That's either Coast Guard, so you're protecting your own coast and denying enemy access to it, or it's a preliminary operation to an amphibious landing where the aggressor power is preparing the way. So in the case of the latter, the former rather, would be the Americans in the American Revolution trying to protect the coastline from the British. And aspect of the latter would be D-Day, where the Allies are preparing the coastal regions for the final invasion of France. The second role, I'd say, is convoy protection. So the idea is if the enemy has commerce raiders, you can then deploy your vessels to protect your trading vessels so they don't get destroyed. The third role is privateering, which would include also what submarines did in World War I and World War II, attacking enemy commerce. So it's more of an indirect method of naval combat. Amphibious operations, which are probably one of the oldest forms of operations going back to antiquity, dependent on some land objective. And then blue water power projection, which is where you have ships able to go out into deep water to project naval power for whatever goal. Maybe that's to protect trade routes. Maybe that's to pursue gunboat diplomacy. Maybe that's to protect convoys, whatever. So we have basically two broad periods of history, the age of the galley and the age of independent operations. And then we have five basic roles: littoral regions, convoys, privateers, amphibious, and blue water. And what makes Mahan, why we have to wait for him, is we have to have enough data points to be digested. So from the beginning of the Columbian Age all the way down to 1890, we have roughly 450 years of accumulated naval history of combat, supporting operations, and now there's enough data points for someone to analyze. So right at the beginning of the Age of Sail, we don't have any data points. It's anyone's guess what's going to happen on the high seas. And then furthermore, you not only have to have the data points, you have to have a sufficiently literate population such that a person has enough leisure time and education to sift through all that material and then have the specific spark of insight that Mahan does have to then synthesize all of that together. So I think those reasons are why we had to wait in part so long for Mahan to come up with his strategic work.
And that's going to be the sort of modus operandi of our thinking, at least for how long it took for naval power to be developed. And while we're at it, I think it's also important to discuss the timing of this work. That, I mean, this isn't the first work that Mahan put out on naval power, but it is certainly the most influential. And there's the background in this, especially when it comes talking about, most famously, a lot of people reference chapter 1 of the influence of sea power upon history, because this is primarily sort of offering the elements of sea power and what we can consider Mahanian thinking. And sort of some background to this is that for the United States Navy is gutted after the Civil War, after 1865. It went into a period of decline. In 1864, the United States Navy had about 51,000 men in uniform, almost 700 ships, and about 60 monitor-type littoral ironclad ships, making them literally the second largest navy in the world after Great Britain. By 1880, that went down to 6,000 men in uniform, both on ships and on shore facilities, with 48 ships in commission. And at that time, the United States Congress had believed that there was no time at the present moment to update or look at their military, and specifically their Navy, and upgrade it. This was a time of demilitarization and more focused internally on reconstruction and expansion westward. And what really sorts to set this off, and what really gets Mahan thinking, is a little piece of U.S. history that often gets ignored, what is known as the Virginius Affair, which takes place in 1873 and goes to about 1875, but the real affair happens October 30th, 1873. So after the American Civil War, Cuba, under Spanish rule, pretty much rebels, and I believe it's in 1868 they go under what's known as the 10 Years' War, and they're trying to get themselves out of Spanish colonial rule. However, it wouldn't be until much later into this conflict that the United States begins to be supporting the Cubans in their effort for independence. And at the time, the Virginius was a small, side wheel steamer craft, served as a blockade runner, and was going between Havana and Mobile, Alabama. It's one of the things that it had done during the Civil War. However, the crew had been captured by the Spanish Navy. They were deemed as privateers and smugglers and were promptly executed, the entire crew. And despite the fact that there was numerous uproar and cry out to fight against the Spanish afterwards, the American Navy, as I just mentioned, was in no position to do so. And the Spanish Navy had 4 ships already within, Cuban territorial waters that had the capacity to destroy a littoral ironclad ship that the Americans still had in operation. So this is just the beginning of the illustration of how important Mahan is, not only just globally, but most importantly to the United States as it begins to remilitarize, especially after 1894, I'd want to say, because keep in mind, this text is published 1890. Anything that you wanted to add there?
Well, yeah, just the fact that this pattern you mentioned, by the way, of militarizing for war and then demilitarizing. This has been a classic example of U.S. history up until 1945. So whether it was the American Revolution, the American Civil War, or World War I, what will often happen is the U.S. forces would be, quote-unquote, underprepared for the conflict that would then build up to meet the demands of the conflict and then voluntarily disband whatever military assets they developed. Now, part of that was the national character of the Americans, the fear of a standing army. If you read the Federalist Papers, there's a whole host of arguments adduced. In fact, that's why we have the Second Amendment. Madison believed that if everybody was armed in Europe, then all the royal houses would be overthrown. So there's that. Now, the Navy's a little different, right? Because even in the Federalist Papers, Hamilton and others advocate that a navy is less of a threat to liberty than a standing army. So why the United States disbanded its navy after the Civil War seems to be more economic based, the exploitation of the then frontier. And this kind of dovetails into some insights that Mahan had at the end of the 19th century. So he said that historically, the United States, from its colonial period up until, say, 1890, had relied on defense in the sense that the ocean was so wide and different, so far from Europe. And so it was very difficult for a European army to invade America. Only the British could really do it, and they failed twice. So you could rely on that as a buffer. And then furthermore, the market development of resources and goods could be absorbed by the ever-growing frontier. And so that was this, from the colonial period all the way up until 1890. Now, one could argue that, Mahan is possibly leaving out the fact that the Monroe Doctrine only had teeth because the British sought in their interest to back it up as well to prevent other Europeans from getting in. Regardless, the United States began to rethink its overall position because with the closing of the frontier in 1890, we then needed new markets to absorb our production. So that led to the United States competing with Germany and France and Britain and Spain for global markets, which then necessitated to having naval assets, which could then protect those trading fleets. And then furthermore, with the advent of modern battleships, pre-dreadnought battleships, and the speed that coal and later oil could produce, the distance element was shrunk. And so Mahan said, we need to, because of all of these broader strategic factors, we need to rethink what the American naval policy is.
Yeah, and Mahan kind of outlines it again, what we talk about in chapter 1, within the influence of sea power amongst history. And Mahan really outlines his thinking primarily on the economic side of things. While there was a lot of emphasis, again, at the very beginning of the American identity that an army is more threatening than a navy, Mahan recognizes that the changing of the world is getting a lot smaller and a lot quicker than I think many people realize. Mahan had said in interviews at the time after publication, as well as in various lectures at the United States Naval War College, that the American concern about invasion is going to change because there's going to be a lot more vested European parties that are interested in the North America, Central and South America, primarily since the big construction of the Panama Canal had begun in 1881. And now that the sort of frontier, the West, had been conquered both by the Transcontinental Railroad and the heavy amount of shipping with Asiatic countries, and this is something that he will write about later in 1892 after the influences of sea power, is that, okay, American naval thinking needs to change. And one of the things that Mahan sort of begins to point out is about how serious nations need to start taking their navies seriously. Not just for, coastal protection, which has been traditionally what the Americans have done, but secondly, also to provide protection and open routes for trade, for naval commerce. At the beginning of the United States' naval history, what was primarily funded wasn't a standing military, of course. What instead was funded was a cutter service by a U.S. naval cutter service in 1790. The creation of an official navy wouldn't come until 4 years later with the Naval Act of 1794. But Mahan outlines the importance of, one, rethinking naval strategy, two, the importance of having actual large fleets, and then third is that nations can only really project power by what they're able to produce and what they can trade with in order to produce that wealth, which wealth, actual money, revenue, the ability to buy allies and influence and fundraise for a military is quintessential. And the Navy is going to be the viability for that because naval trade, as the text will outline, throughout history has been the biggest area and the easiest way to trade internationally, sort of since the early modern era of, the 1600s onwards.
Well, what's interesting is this idea that we need a large navy to protect global trade to export markets to soak up local production goods actually seems to overlap with Lenin's that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, which is what Lenin is basically saying, that these markets are soaked up by these colonies. But what's interesting here is you mentioned, of course, finance. And I think what needs to be set in a broader strategic context is beginning with the age of commerce in the Columbian age, so they roughly overlap in the 15th, 16th century. We see a shift in the way war is fought. Historically, war was not capital intensive. I mean, yes, you had to pay soldiers, but if we look at, say, referring back to the Mackinder thesis, which was derived from the study of the nomadic steppe peoples, these military forces were not highly capitalized, and yet they were the most efficient military forces up until the advent of gunpowder. So what we see is a pivoting from a low capital intensive war to high capital intensive war. And that's in part the result of financing, because with financing, you can now develop R&D. The nomads couldn't make guns, so then the European powers and the Chinese could then use those guns to defeat them. And it creates a knock-on effect where the more you do this, the more advanced weapons you get, which creates this arms race. So it's this connection of finance and capitalization and technological development that are all happening in the 15th century that are creating these knock-on effects that make this necessary. Now, for Mahan, there's a big debate that, is still going on, the debate between commerce rating and blue water power projection navies. So, for example, a lot of what we might call old right American advocates or libertarians today tend to be favorable of privateering. There was the myth of national defense. There was a whole essay from the Mises Institute on privateering. And that tends to be more of a, small republic, little America type position. And then there's the more what we might either call, imperialist America or pragmatic America, where we want big navies, big guns, big carriers. And that's the Mahanian legacy. And what I think is interesting is the way Mahan treats commerce rating, because if you look at the examples he gives, of course, the French versus the British, and then even the Americans versus the British in the American Revolution, even though, significant amounts of shipping were destroyed, it did not prevent the British from doing the most important thing that the Navy could do, which was deploy troops to other parts of the world. The British could still deploy troops to the Caribbean and take French islands. The British could still deploy troops along the southern seaboard of the United States with their gambit under Cornwallis, and it still didn't stop them. So commerce rating by itself, I don't think works. We also saw this in World War II with the German U-boats in World War I. Ultimately, it caused a lot of pain for the Allies, but convoys are an effective counter. Now, I think Mahan goes a little too far, because if you look at the U.S. war in the Pacific, the convoy raiding was a part of our strategy against the Japanese, and it brought them to their knees by 1945. So commerce rating by itself is not a substitute for any of the other roles of naval combat that I listed, but as a part of a suite of options, I think it's useful. And what's a little known fact, people forget that the British also pursued commerce rating in the wars against France and the wars against the American Republic. So it's not like they forwent that. They did that as well. But it was a part of a suite of a broader naval strategy. So I think Mahan is right, but he overstates his case and forgets that as a part of a broader suite, it's still valuable.
Yeah, so the phrase is known as guerre de course, commerce rating as it's known, privateering. And Mahan rightfully points out that it is one aspect of naval strategy that doesn't work on its own independently, specifically because, like you had said, during the 7 Years' War, the British still lost a substantial amount of their commerce fleet. I believe at the time it was almost a third of the British merchant fleet had been decimated. And even then, they were still able to project power elsewhere. And Mahan argues that, guerre de course, while effective at limiting trade, unless you take out, and we can get now into the conversation of the decisive battle, unless you're willing to actually properly keep the fleet localized, then that's the issue. Because during the 7 Years' War, the British fleet is put out in pretty much into four quadrants. You have Europe, North America, the Caribbean, and India. And because the French are primarily focused on, trying to fight them, abroad, primarily in North America, and, trying to cripple their trade and not trying to keep them contained inside of their European quadrant, forcing the British back towards Europe, for resupply as well as to take care of the French fleet. This is something that Mahan argues as to why the French had lost and why you cannot specifically rely on commerce raiding. And I think that you bring up the Japanese is actually a really good point, because like during World War I and World War II, German U-boat campaigns did not cripple the ability to project force or power abroad. And I think that lies with an interesting question in the 21st century that we can probably speculate on, is that given so much of our trade is now sort of electronic, digital, over the internet, a lot of it is financial, what we see on the markets, how much is it really worth having the material good of it being seized when a lot of our wealth nowadays is on a ledger somewhere? But the point that Mahan makes is that while you can't explicitly rely on commerce raiding, you also need to find ways to contain the fleet, which brings up the concept of the decisive battle.
Yeah, so the idea is, as a preliminary to the decisive battle, Mahan makes the distinction that the seas are like a commons, unlike land. So you can't sort of like, draw frontier boundaries and build forts and entrenchments and say, this is my side, that's your side. There's really the only way to stop somebody from moving across the sea is to physically interpose your ships to say that you can't go any further. But as soon as your ships move, well, then it's open again. So it's this sort of free-flowing commons. And so the goal is to attain control of the sea. And control of the sea means that basically your ships can go anywhere and can then fulfill the other four roles, amphibious operations, convoy raiding, all of those things for your broader war goals. And he thinks that the best way to achieve this is the decisive battle. Now, what's interesting, this is also parallel with the thinkings of the Prussian general staff, like Helmut von Moltke, looking at the lessons from the Battle of Sedan in 1870 rather, where the French were encircled and destroyed. Now, obviously, that didn't work out so well in World War I, but the idea of a decisive battle is sort of, you could say, a legacy of Cannae. Hannibal defeated the Romans so completely in that battle that whether it's the Schleifen looking back in history to that, but what I think people misunderstand about decisive battle is Hannibal still lost the war. He still lost the war against Rome. So I think it's a misreading of history. But that's sort of the context for the idea of a decisive battle. So from Mahan, you bring all of your ships to bear at the decisive point to then destroy the enemy fleets. Now, it's even better if you can blockade them in port, but if that can't be done, then you ought to do that. Now, what's interesting here, because the sea is a commons, because you can't, quote unquote, hold ground, one of the cardinal rules of land warfare is always have a reserve. But in naval warfare, we don't really have that rule. It's better to deploy as many or all of your ships as possible to achieve victory in as short a time as possible. And I think part of the reason is if you're fighting on land, and let's say you sally out from a castle, and then you fight the enemy, you have a place to withdraw to for defense. So it does behoove yourself not to commit everything if you don't have to. But at sea, especially if you're fighting in some far-flung region of the world, it's kind of all or nothing. You either win or you lose, and there's nowhere to go if you lose. So I think the very different geography of the ocean creates a different set of conditions and pressures under which a decisive battle takes place. And I think because it does lend itself to a more all or nothing situation, it makes decisive battle more decisive than, say, when on land. But even then, decisive battle is a bit ephemeral. Let's look at the Battle of Jutland in 1916 in the World War I. Both the British and the Germans were trying to achieve a decisive battle, and yet both of them weren't able to get that. And it's in part because when you realize how much you're committing, it's like, if it's all or nothing and you lose all your, multi-million-dollar dreadnoughts, that's a huge blow to national prestige. It's almost like, do we really want to go all the way with this? Maybe we don't want to lose all of our dreadnoughts. And then also, at least in World War I, this was before the age of the radio, at least on seaboard radio, they were still communicating with semaphore in the Battle of Jutland. So it makes it more difficult to coordinate. You could argue that, say, for example, the Battle of Leyte Gulf in 1944 was a decisive battle, even though the turning point in the Pacific arguably had been achieved 2 years earlier at Midway. So I think what's interesting here is that the decisive battle concept kind of comes out of this more terrestrial philosophy, which is based on reflections of Hannibal and Sedan and other conflicts, and has, I think, similar pros and cons as it does on land, but because of the nature of sea geography, it's a little more achievable than, say, trying to repeat it in World War I.
Yeah, and the thing is that with the sea being the commons and the inability to have, actual entrenchment, the other aspect, not only to the decisive battle, but I think the corollary to it, which Mahan sort of proposes and the Americans adopt, is the idea of having a global network chain to geographically, resupply your ships and to defend them in port if necessary. So the island strategy for the United States, which one, Mahan views the United States as an island. There are two long stretch of coasts that are geographically available for ports that can be defended with smaller littoral combat ships or by privateers if necessary. And that the likelihood of invasion from the north or south is highly unlikely because of its land strength. So really, you're really more concerned about naval power projection. And you have two coastlines available to project power on both areas. The United States, continental U.S. is an island. And if you want to project power abroad, sort of that pragmatist approach that Praise was talking about, then you need to have island chains or friendly nations in order to resupply and arm and defend your ships if necessary abroad. And you sort of start to see this theory in action in the Spanish-American War once there starts to make a move upon the Philippines. This is where Hawaii becomes an area of strategic importance to the United States from 1896 onwards. But also to bring about the decisive battle. There he sort of mentions this throughout the his commentaries, which I'm trying to remember what chapter it is, but he goes over the Anglo-Dutch wars in the 17th century, where series of decisive battles between the French Navy and the British Navy and their losses. He like the third Anglo-Dutch war, I think he talks about, where when the English lose 12 ships compared to only 2 ships on that side, and you're unable to raise more money to supply your navy or to impress enemy troops on your own side as crewmen, then you've decisively lost, and the victory is gone. Which means there's aspects of the decisive victory of that time that is definitely held up. Because keep in mind, this is published in 1890. Things are not what they are today. Like Praise had mentioned with Jutland, there's not yet seaborne radio.
Yeah, exactly. And so one of the aspects he moves into is the foundations for a robust naval strategy and power. There's 6 points that he covers. One, the first third can be roughly classified as geographic, and the second third can be roughly classified as demographic. So, good position, that would be like, say, an island or a strategic, peninsula, lengthy coastline, and good terrain and harbors. And so with these, you can then see you need coastlines so you can actually have people whose livelihood is on the sea. And so therefore, see, one of the things he gets into as well, a dictatorship might be able to impose naval buildup by fiat. He doesn't have the underlying substructure to maintain it. And he actually points to Louis XIV in his wars against Britain. He, in the 1680s and 90s, he had a larger fleet than the British, chasing him around, what Beachy had in 1690. But once he started suffering defeats, he couldn't replenish those losses because he didn't have a sufficiently developed merchant marine. And that's in some sense a function of a large coastline where people naturally go to sea for their profession. And then you could say the demographic elements are population, so the numbers, the naval manpower, how many sailors do you have, national character. Are you a kind of people that are a seafaring people, or at least value the necessity of seafaring? And then the character of government, where he says that republics and democracies are more amenable to this strategy than despots. I'll make one caveat, though. One of the greatest naval powers in history was the Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire maintained naval control over large parts of the Mediterranean for hundreds of years. So it's not a hard and fast rule. I think the really important underlying substructure here is some sort of facilocracy, some sort of a commercial enterprises. If you're primarily production oriented or primarily agriculture, then you're not going to as much be investing resources into naval development. And the other benefits that a republic or democracy have is once you get enough of the population behind it, it creates this head of steam. So with one despot to the next, the guy that succeeds, you might have a totally different policy and just gut the Navy. But I would argue, though, that's exactly what happened in America, though, right? Because after the Civil War, we gutted our Navy. So I'm not entirely sure that republics, qua republics, have this decisive advantage that Mahan wants to give them, because the very thing he was criticizing about Louis XIV seemed to have happened right after the Civil War with the United States. We let our Navy, disintegrate. But again, if we look at broad trends and don't press the analogy too hard, I think he's still largely correct.
Yeah, and that's when I was reading it again, because I've got my copy over here, and he was mentioning about republics. It kind of just reminded me of that Milton Friedman quote about the closest thing we'll get to immortality, right, is a government bureaucracy. But that's the thing, is I think also he's mentioning it in reference to the British Navy at the time, because you have a parliamentary system over there. And the British Navy is constantly funded. This is the home site of the Industrial Revolution. And I think this is where he's beginning to get his idea is that once you're an industrial country and you need to start exporting more and you're an export economy and you want access to foreign markets, especially because you want goods out there. Because again, the first chapter where he's outlining his naval strategy for the US is basically around, okay, if you want to generate wealth and have that ability to wield it for power, then you need to have access to commerce and access to trade, which means a foreign market and a merchant marine fleet that can be protected. And that's the other thing that he mentions throughout the historical aspect, especially is when he's talking about the Anglo-Dutch Wars and he's talking about the battles in the 7 Years' War, is that if you're primarily either relying on foreign markets, like a mercantilist-based economy, then your parliamentary system wants to maintain that. And you need that sort of industrial or at least mercantilist class to keep it going. And that's something that I think to this day, it's kind of been proven true, that now that the world is innately globalized and interconnected, something that Mahan saw was on the horizon, that, we're always going to need that kind of naval fleet. But I mean, in a time where it was sort of the age of sail, we're just beginning to see, steamboats, clippers, ironclads, that the world seems still progressively smaller. And again, like we had talked about earlier, the American character to sort of just withdraw and retract our military forces, not only within character, but something we had seen historically throughout European eras, that anytime after war, you're achieving some sense of economic or political dominance via treaty, then there's no need to, enforce it or just rely on commerce rating.
Yeah. Now, to go to something a little more concrete, what's interesting is the way Mahan covers the American Revolution. Because what's interesting about the American Revolution as the sort of different from the broader trends he's covering, the British, both before the American Revolution and after the Revolution, whipped the French fleets pretty regularly, pretty easily. But during the American Revolution, they do rather poorly. So it's Admiral Graves from the French that blocks the Chesapeake Bay to prevent Cornwallis from leaving, and actually does defeat a British relief force. You also have Admiral Suffren operating, I think, out of Madras in India, creating a lot of economic damage to the British colonies there. And so he basically broadly contextualizes this into the fact that while you do have basically four zones, Europe, the American coastline, the Caribbean, and India, the entire Atlantic was itself one giant region, interconnected region. And the British made the mistake of not blockading the French and Spanish ports immediately, allowing them to actually get to sea in the first place. And so for once, the French can actually concentrate for the decisive battle in Virginia, because normally the French are spread out everywhere and the British can then consolidate. But because they had enemies in America, enemies in Europe, because once we got to Saratoga in 1778, and the French and then later the Spanish and then later the Dutch joined the war, England pulls back most of its resources to protect the home islands, because at that point, if the French do invade, if the Spanish do invade, it's over. And they're doing damage control now, which pretty much more or less ensures the Americans are going to walk away with a victory at this point. And so he sort of more broadly contextualizes this as the British should have blockaded those ships earlier on. They should have seen that the French were going to come in. They should have had a reserve to blockade them. But what I think is interesting, and actually what I think is lovely about Mahan's work, is there's all these little known figures. Like before I read The Influence of Sea Power on History, I had no idea the Dutch defeated the English twice at sea. You had de Ruyter, who defeated a combined Franco-English fleet, and you think the Dutch pulled this off. That's kind of incredible. And then Suffren, the great French admiral of the Indian Ocean, all of this stuff is very esoteric, very niche. Because, and I think in part, the Royal Navy has this carefully cultivated propaganda that it was always the best, and that things like Suffren, things like Graves, things like the Dutch kind of don't get the airtime that they otherwise would get.
Yeah, and now that you mentioned the siege of Yorktown and the French blockade there, this also kind of brings back the island discussion as well, because right after the siege of Yorktown and sort of what is considered for us sort of like the end of the war, the decisive American victory on the ground, the French and the British are still fighting. And the British, I think, sort of really provide their advantage here of relying on islands and knowing how to play that to their advantage, where we sort of start seeing the breaking the line concept. Or he mentions the Battle of the Saints, inside the battle of sort of the Dominican Republic at the time, which I believe was French owned. And the British were able to take advantage of the fact that the French weren't using the actual ground of the islands, whether it be Guadalupe, Dominica, Martinique, and St. Lucia. All of these, they just kept pressing them further and further down the line and not really engaging until they had managed to go to Saints Island. And the French, and unable to use their, actual territory to their advantage, is something that Mahan talks about and why they're actually important. Because he criticizes this, one, because the French, both during the 7 Years' War, but also during the sort of its involvement of the American Revolution, is that it's primarily focused on North America, and it's not taking a look at how the British Navy is organized. Like I mentioned earlier, it's done in quadrants. You have North America, the Caribbean, India, and Europe. And one, the thing that Mahan points out is that they're not focusing on trying to keep the French or the British contained inside Europe. And then two, there's primarily a focus for the French along the transatlantic area as well as North America. They're not focused primarily in the Caribbean or in the South, which allows the British to take advantage of the fact that they can, strike while the iron is hot, at least where they can still deploy their navy. And the fact that the French don't take advantage of their ports and how to defend their area, they leave themselves vulnerable to break the line from the British and lead to British victory.
Now, what's interesting here, too, is Mahan observes a trend which we continue to see down to the present day with the Treaty of Utrecht, which ends the War of Spanish Succession. So we know from the three Anglo-Dutch wars that Holland, backstory, Holland is the first country that creates what we would call today the global economy. The global economy really begins with Holland and the East India Company, the VOC, and the Dutch Stock Exchange. Those are all the hallmarks of a modern global economy. Now, when that happens, England is in a rising power and is trying to compete for that same space. Unsuccessfully, of course, because the first Anglo-Dutch War was an English victory because it was under Oliver Cromwell, and that falls outside the scope of his work. But the two Anglo-Dutch wars that he does cover, the second and the third, were Dutch victories. But what happened was, as the war against France continued to build up over the decades, the Dutch became sort of pigeonholed as the land army. They were going to raise the troops that were going to fight the French, and the British were going to raise the fleets that were going to fight the French on sea. And of course, necessity demanded this because the Louis XIV could invade Holland directly over land through Belgium. So what happens, though, is the trade is shifted. The main port goes from, I think, is Amsterdam to Antwerp, which is now outside of the Dutch possession, and trade starts to flow out from the Dutch. And then, of course, with the Navigation Acts, where the English control all shipping into their own country through English ships, they then get to pick up on this. And so the money flow from Holland is taken out. So in this case, the Thucydides trap does not lead to a direct conflict. It leads to one becoming a junior partner, and then eventually withering away as his commitment to the land overwhelms his commitment to the sea. And we saw the same thing with the British and the Americans. The British were the dominant sea power until the end of World War II. And because they had, from 1914 to 1945, they had shifted their focus away from the splendid isolation of the 19th century to direct combat in Europe proper. They had a larger military land role. And as a result, rather than a conflict with the United States, which was in some sense forestalled with the great rapprochement in the 1890s, they then became what happened to the Dutch in 1713 happened to them in 1945, where because of their overcommitment on land, rather than a direct conflict with America, they then kind of withered away to become a vassal satellite state. Now, that doesn't mean direct naval conflicts won't occur. I mean, we saw that with Japan and the United States in the Pacific War. There's some question whether that'll happen between the United States and China today. But it does seem, though, that the trend since, say, 17th century is that the Thucydides trap between the dominant naval powers doesn't really happen the way it does on land.
The other thing I would add too, since we mentioned the War of Spanish Succession, is that a lot of people consider this the first global war because of sea power. And one of the things that not only does the Dutch port move outside of sort of Dutch control, right, to Antwerp, the Dutch also take a huge beating in terms of trade because they're incapable, they're too focused on the continent. They're not focused on what is reliant for their merchant marine fleet, that of the Dutch, East India Company. And so what do we see at the same time of the War of Spanish Succession is also Queen Anne's War in North America, but also in the West Indies, where this is hugely a profitable commodity, which is mainly sugar and other cane plantations at the time. And the war it just guts the Dutch East India Company, and they're unable to protect the merchant marine fleet that the Dutch have in North America. So the Dutch are just absolutely obliterated economically, and this is something that Mahan writes about in the same chapter, I believe. I think it's the penultimate chapter where he's talking about after Yorktown. He refers to that as well as the War of Spanish Succession. Like, if you're unable to defend the merchant marine fleet and you're primarily relying on a mercantilist or an export economy, then that leaves yourself particularly vulnerable. And again, it sort of raises the interesting question of what that would look like today versus the United States and China. And this is something that we've talked about on the channel before, that Dr. Samantra Mitra writes, is that how likely can you maintain a naval blockade when you're dealing with, one, a highly defendable coastline, but two, you're also reliant on these exports. And that becomes the key question of how much you're willing to sacrifice.
Well, what's interesting, the decline of Holland that you just described, it very closely mirrors the decline of Athens. Once the Spartans were able to get a competent naval commander under Lysander, they were able to piece by piece dismantle the Athenian Delian League and cut off supply of grain from the Caspian region and to attack Athenian shipping. And so this is why an island is better than say a peninsula or an inlet, because an island can focus completely on naval power, whereas say Athens or Carthage or Netherlands has to focus on land and sea power because they can technically be invaded from the land. And what I think was also interesting too is if you look at Andrew Lambert in his book Sea Power States, where he talks about just the idea of nations whose very existence depends on the sea. So he uses Athens, Carthage, Venice, and then also the Dutch and the British. Now he says that generally, if we look at the showdowns that they had, Athens beats the Persians. Carthage is fighting other commercial powers, the Greeks, and then later the Romans. The more commercial oriented powers tend to do better in the short term. But there are limits, and he talks about continental powers that have navies. We could include the Persians from antiquity. We could include the Roman Empire, and by extension, the Byzantine Empire, and then the United States today. And I think what's interesting is that when a commercial power like, say, Holland or Great Britain fights a consolidated continental power that also decides to build a navy, they generally lose. Carthage lost to Rome. Japan, an island power, lost to the United States, a continental power. And if you look at the competitors to, say, Byzantium, up until very near the end with the Venetians in the Fourth Crusade, they were generally successful as well. So it's interesting to see how the United States, being a continental power, but without having to have continental obligations of a large standing army, can just dump all of this into its navy. And it creates this sort of hypertrophy effect where it just becomes this gargantuan behemoth. Now, this creates an interesting question, though. If we look at the history of trade routes both on land and on sea, there's a point at which the lines in the graph cross. The amount of defense spending you have to protect those trade routes exceeds any expected revenue you will receive from those trade routes. And in light of the vast cost of the USS Gerald Ford aircraft carrier, one begins to wonder, are we nearing that tipping point where the cost of the Navy is exceeding the expected revenues of global trade for which it's there to protect?
And we're going to see that play out, especially when it comes time towards the Spanish-American War, when the United States begins to mobilize. But the other thing that I would also like to sort of, now that we can mention trade and the idea about these sort of obligations you have as a continental power without requiring an army. I think this sort of brings us into taking a look at Mahan's contemporaries. So, of course, probably the most famous one that a lot of people like to peg either yourself as someone like Mahan or his counterpart, which is Sir Julian Stafford Corbett, which is the sort of British contemporary at the time. He was a British naval historian as well as a strategic writer of the time. And he is well known for putting a lot of focus on the concept known as fleet in being, a naval force that extends a controlling influence without ever leaving port. Whereas a lot of people think that Mahan is primarily, and you have to view these two as counter and one of the other. You should really be viewing Mahan and Corbett as complementary to one another. And Corbett especially synthesizes a lot of what Mahan argues and discusses in the first chapter of Influence of Sea Power Upon History, because the first chapter is a relatively short read. And if you take the time to actually look up the text, you can get it on PDF right now. You'll find that chapter 1 very quick compared to every other chapter. And this is him trying to outline pretty much an entire, geostrategic policy for the United States in a couple of bullet points, whereas Corbett really takes the time to start outlining what Corbett thinks about naval warfare, but also how to expand upon what Mahan has talked about. So one of the things that I would say is that neither gentleman offer sort of a fully comprehensive theory of warfare at sea. He focuses on the idea of strategy, primarily more so than Mahan on the aspect of economics. So, naval warfare is meant to be the power of a country. And this is, of course, a lot of bit of the British bias there, I think, because it is an island country in the same way that, Mahan thinks of itself as an island country. You have to protect lines of communication, which are difficult to enforce more on sea than by land, because keep in mind, this is written at a time when there's no seaborne communication. And that you have to have command of the sea. So for Mahan, the idea for command of the sea is usually achieved either by a decisive battle or that you can successfully blockade a territory and keep their naval forces in port, or they're just not in use right now. Corbett command at sea was relative. It wasn't an absolute state of being, which means it could happen and it could be localized. It could be very temporary or permanent. It wasn't something that Mahan just considered, and I think very loosely, to be this permanent idea leading up to the decisive battle. These two gentlemen, I think, should be very closely viewed and synthesized together. And in fact, Kevin D. McCrane wrote a fantastic book about why you should be viewing these two together. And I believe it's called, I'm going to try and find it now, it's called Mahan, Corbett, and the Foundations of Naval Strategic Thought. Because too many people like to peg these gentlemen in their own unique camps where, strategy isn't this necessarily doctrinaire thing, because throughout the text, Mahan is a little against necessarily doctrined naval strategy, whereas Corbett is very much oriented in this. He thinks that, both men need to be viewed differently because they're far more nuanced than most modern, commentators and thinkers will give them credit for.
So, to put it broadly speaking, Mahan is a Jominian and Corbett is a Clausewitzian. And so, if we look at the two competing Napoleonic theorists, Jomini, the Swiss mercenary who fought with Napoleon, and then Clausewitz, who fought against Napoleon. Again, these are oversimplifications, but broadly speaking, they're correct. Jomini views war as more of an application of mathematical and geometric principles. So he views war more as the arithmetic or geometry, whereas Clausewitz views more as an art, a subtle game of intuition. And so if you then look at, because sea power strategy is a derivative of land power strategy, even if you look at these two authors. And so now what's interesting though is you don't have to read Jomini and Clausewitz as antinomies if you don't want to. You can sort of create this broader synthesis of the two. I'm more of a Clausewitzian persuasion. I think there is more nuance. You can't write these hard, fast arithmetic rules. That's not to say that what Jomini says is false. I mean, if you stand astride someone's line of communication and they do nothing, then yeah, they probably will starve to death eventually. But that's assuming they don't do anything. They might do something to get out of that situation. And that tends to be where the different nuances are coming from for these two naval strategists. What's interesting, though, is given that all of this discussion was facilitated by how technology shortens distances and changes projection power, beginning with World War II and onward, we see a lot of really interesting things here. First of all, we see the ascendancy of air power over the sea, with the hegemony of the aircraft carrier as demonstrated in the Pacific War with Japan. We also see, for the first time in history, an invasion of an island without control of the sea with Germany's invasion of Crete, which is the decisive win for air power. The fact that the British controlled all of the sea around that and the Germans could still take it, admittedly with heavy losses, it's a total game changer. And they repeated it wasn't a one-off. They repeated this again in 1943, and I think it's the Decisive Islands in the Aegean Sea. They were Italian islands that when Italy defected to the Allies, the Germans took by airborne operations in 1943 and then repelled a British counterattack. So we see that during the Cold War. What we see is with the development of Soviet long-range bombers, they developed this kind of strategy of using strategic bombers with missiles as counters to enemy ships. So they could fly out into the Atlantic, usually over Norway and through Iceland. And then that was the theory. And then they would launch these missile volleys at incoming American convoys and then go back. Now, how sustainable would that have been in a real Third World War? We don't really know. But we do see, though, that the littoral regions, if the enemy has air dominance, makes it increasingly difficult to project naval power. We're also beginning to see with the rise of hypersonic missiles, especially with Russia and China, that even without control of the air, one can make naval operations along the coast very risky. So basically what air power and then the development of missile technology produces is a kind of security umbrella over the sea whereby a weaker power at sea can deny access to the enemy. And the question is, we haven't really seen the full application of this in a modern context. How much would it be the case that sea power is constrained by the development of a combined interlocking defense system of hypersonic missiles and air power? And that's really the question of today.
So I'm gonna get to that point, but I'm gonna wheel it back just a tad. I'm gonna go back to Corbett and Mahan, and then I'll talk about Clausewitz, and then we'll get to the top there because there's a lot of points I want to add on to it. So Corbett, like we had mentioned, or like how we had begun, is also very Clausewitzian in his viewpoints. That there are unique circumstances that you can't be entirely doctrinaire. However, this doesn't mean that you ignore the very basic aspects of what we know as general strategy. So, for instance, Corbett is not a strong believer in complete concentration. He says, quote, a truism, no one would dispute it, a canon, a practical strategy, it is untrue. Corbett felt that, concentration would not only make it harder for you to hide or, put out your whereabouts and movements, but he's also admitting to the fact that this allows you to have an effective force of deterrence against your enemy, because a weaker opponent would probably not want to seek battle if there's a higher concentration of enemy troops, especially if you're going down the line that has an exceptional form of communication amongst the fleet. And evolving this, right, we kind of see how an overwhelming naval presence some can effectively work against a smaller foe. So, post-Battle of Midway, you're now beginning to see an effective line of communication without necessarily that strong concentration. But at this point, of course, in time, there's seaborne radio and other forms of communication. Yet it illustrates that if you have a superior force and you can concentrate that power, even from a distance between a carrier group being defended by frigates, destroyers, surrounding the American policy of using aircraft carriers, then concentration isn't necessary when you have the ability to move up. But at the same time, it also can work if you can concentrate your forces around an island and there's a weaker, inferior naval force to defend it. And that sort of becomes the doctrine that we see in the Second World War in the Pacific. Getting into the modern time, I think that it'll be really interesting to see in the wake of hypersonic missiles and other electronic communication and electronic warfare, how well the naval strategy of carrier-based forces is going to last for the United States. When talking about Taiwan prior to the invasion of Ukraine, their big discussion was, is the United States aware of what the cost of this kind of conflict would be over Taiwan in a naval context? Because you would be trying to defend an island that is now up against very well-placed littoral defenses, both by sea, but most importantly by ground. by land. And that illustrates that maybe the strategic thinkers in the White House or the Rand Corporation haven't considered that you might lose 5,000 men very quickly by the single hit of a hypersonic missile coming from the Chinese, trying to, make sure that Taiwan is taken and American defenses don't hold. But this sort of also brings up air power that was mentioned as well. So you really see the two major thinkers of the turn of the century, the 20th, come into being. So for sea power, you have the synthesis of Corbett and Mahan. And then, of course, there's Duchette for air superiority and air campaigns and bombing, that you don't necessarily need land or naval power if you can decimate enemy forces by air in order to then either land them for paratroopers or decimate an area through strategic bombing campaigns, which is seen heavily throughout the Second World War. The only ones that really didn't practice it were the Soviets, and this is in part because they're more focused on land forces. Their air forces not so much in comparison, although it does exist. And that sort of brings us to sort of today, where we're looking at, how Mahan holds up and what you can see is its sort of contemporary critics and takes. When you look at almost any document or anyone writing about grand strategy in the United States, naval power and the importance of the global economy are still front and center. Mahan's idea that you need to have if you're going to be that kind of economy, you need to have a merchant fleet to protect it. And you need to have a navy that can open those sea lanes and open yourself to global trade and able to defend your own vessels from potential piracy or those targeting it, like submarines or what we see in Somalia. And then, of course, air power has been evolving. I can't give too much commentary there. Some aspects of Duchette and carrier-based air forces are still there. But the latest critique that I've seen has been primarily coming from the realist school of thought. And for instance, restraint, Barry Posen argues that the United States Navy needs to be more restrained, not being so focused on carrier bases and power projection, but rather defending your key areas and ports of trade and those with international allies. And that he argues that the Navy should actually be smaller than what it currently is today in 2022. And then, of course, the most famous critique from the realist school comes by John J. Mearsheimer in The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. He argues, and I'll just quote it here real quick, for more than a century, strategists have debated which form of military power dominates the outcome of a war. For U.S. Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahan, who famously proclaimed the superior importance of independent sea power and the influence of sea power amongst history and other writings, Duchette in Italy had made the case for the primacy of strategic air power in 1921, the command of the air. Their works are still widely read at staff colleges around the world. I'm going to argue that they're both wrong, and land power is decisive. It is the most decisive military instrument. Wars are won by bigger battalions, not armadas in the air or on the sea. The strongest power is the state with the strongest army. He says that while nuclear weapons might diminish the importance of land power, the only ability to hold territory and to maintain control of strategic ports and locations is the ability to garrison them with land forces. And I think that sort of brings up the big discussion for today.
Well, actually, so I'm going to work in reverse here.
Okay.
I actually completely agree, because I think the record of history. Okay, so I don't want to have a digression on air power, but let me just put it this way: there is what I would call dependent air power as deployed for tactical operational goals. So that would be a classic example. Would be the Germany in the first 2 years of World War II, and then there's strategic air power, which is what the British and the Americans did throughout World War II, bombing cities. I think the record is pretty clear. Strategic air power failed in its stated objective of bringing Germany to its knees, and it failed to bring Japan to its knees. So, by itself, I mean, again, maybe as a part of an ensemble, one can make a case, but even then, given the losses that were suffered, I think that you do need to hold territory. A perfect example of this is in 1944, when the Japanese, with Operation Ichigo, invaded all the air bases that were used by the Flying Tigers. Chanot said, we can just win from the air. And Stilwell was like, no, we need an army. And Roosevelt's like, well, air power is cheaper, so let's do that. And then the Japanese take all the air bases. So, I mean, I think he's completely justified in this thinking. Now, to sort of go back and then forward, if we look at a fleet in being, it serves much the same purpose as an army in being. Classic example of that would be Washington and the American Revolution. He didn't necessarily seek a decisive engagement against the British. He merely hoped to outlast them. Now, once the French joined and a decisive battle was actually possible, then he shifted his focus. But I think we have a lot more historical examples of a successful application of an army in being than a fleet in being. That being said, I think with the rise of modern technology, especially missile technology and remote control technology for like RC suicide boats, if you look at the 2001 War Games with Marine General Riper, he played as Iran, and he used basically advanced swarming tactics with light, small boats to sink an aircraft carrier. And the U.S. Wargaming group stopped the game, rewrote the rules, and then played it again. So that didn't happen. And then a few years ago, the Iranian Navy did a war game using tactics very, very similar to Riper's, and they had a mock-up of a U.S. Enterprise class aircraft carrier, and they tried to attack it. And of course, it's not a real aircraft carrier, so it's just a war game. But the point is, though, that would be a fleet in being. I mean, these swarming vessels that Riper's using and Iran is using are not going to project power to Europe or to America, but they are going to threaten if the power potential is there that the Riper war games indicate, then it would be a sufficient deterrent to not deploy an aircraft carrier into the littoral regions, which would validate Corbett's theory of a fleet in being.
Oh, and if you want confirmation of it, earlier this year when the Russians, Iranians, and the Chinese had conducted joint naval exercises, that's exactly the kind of strategy that the Iranians used. So there's a lot of confirmation, I think, for that kind of thinking about how a fleet in being can operate, especially because I would imagine that the Americans aren't going to put a aircraft carrier that close, but it does illustrate the sort of deterrence of getting too close to littoral waters, which is, I think, what the Iranian strategy is going to be. And we do know that sort of swarming styled strategy has been employed by them before. They've intercepted American craft within the Strait of Hormuz before, or at least has buzzed by them. So I think that that's something to definitely keep in mind in the future, because as air technology continues to evolve, and we're seeing this now in Ukraine with sort of the Turkish drones in place, it helps to deter an enemy, but that doesn't stop the forces from still being present. And we saw this as well in Afghanistan when the Americans began to expand their drone program. If you have aerial supremacy or an aerial superiority, which at that point in time the Americans did in Afghanistan, it didn't matter because the territory is still held by the Taliban. All that they would have to do is have their troops or their cells retreat into the mountains, but they would still come out and engage when they needed to. It's about having the land forces on the ground to, illustrate decisive victory. And I think that that's something that we're going to continue to see, I think, as a trend as time goes on, is that air superiority is a great power force multiplier. But unless you have the ability to garrison those troops and to actually deter them on the ground, then it's not going to matter much. Because even now, with what we're seeing in Ukraine, it's great that you have all of the technicals and the aircraft that you need to mount an offensive. But if the troops on the ground have the necessary tools and weapons to fight back, then it sort of illustrates this doctrine of like mass air or mass technical campaigns are not necessarily going to work without the land forces, the infantry, to do it.
Well, I think what's also interesting too here is if we look at the past and the present, we can see that there's this, what we're seeing especially with the supercarrier concept, like the USS Gerald Ford, is what we may call gargantuanism. Now, the USS Gerald Ford seems to be fully operational now, but when it was deployed in 2017, it had many, many problems that had to be fixed retroactively. It cost something like 10 times more than projected figures. And so it was vastly overpriced. Now, what's interesting is if we look at the great naval war of antiquity, Rome versus Carthage, there was this drive to gigantism with the quinqueremes and the quadremes, and then even further east with the Hellenistic empires, 20s and 30s, if you can believe it. And so what ends up happening, though, is there are two things. Well, actually, a few things. One, ships that big are expensive to lose, and you maybe don't want to lose them. Second of all, ships that big take a lot of resources, and so the people wouldn't know this now, but North Africa and the Middle East and large parts of Southern Europe were heavily forested. But this rise towards gigantism in the shipping led to a shortage of wood. So after the defeat of Carthage, the Romans went back to smaller ships, in part because they had no choice, and in part because at least up back at the time as well, they were unseaworthy and would sink in storms. Now, obviously today, an aircraft carrier is not likely going to sink in a storm, but I think the other two factors are still at play. is it worth having something so big that you can't risk losing it? We saw that also at Jutland with the dreadnoughts. It's you have them and they have all this theoretical power projection, but if you're not going to use it for fear of the cost of losing it, is it even worth having and maintaining? And then second of all, given the costs of the Navy as a whole, vis-a-vis the expected benefits of trade, is it even worth paying for ships that large in the first place? So I think what I would predict is as we go into the future with the advent of air power and missile technology and more sophisticated mines and torpedoes, I think we're going to see a similar trend. We're going to peak with gigantism, like with the Hellenistic ships of the classical period, and then we're going to go down to smaller ships because they're more economical. You can actually use them, and if you lose one, it's not the end of the world. You didn't break the bank. So I don't, and I'm not saying this because I think the carrier is obsolete. I'm not saying that. I just think this trend towards gigantism is going to hit the wall of diminishing returns rather quickly.
I'm going to bring up two comments, and I'm going to sort of give you some reassurance on, I think, your prediction, because this is something that Friedman's talked about. But Monothalmos, one of my favorite Germans to talk to, had said the Allies had reached the German border on the 2nd of October of 1944, but crossed the Rhine March 7th, 1945. It's 5 months for 70 kilometers. All of their air power did not prevent this blunder. Which I think is a good point to make out. But you had mentioned the Gerald Ford, and Steve comments that the Ford hasn't been deployed. It's been starting sea trials. It won't be deployed until the first time this fall. So I guess we'll see how that goes come that time. But this is something that both Friedman as well as Barry Posen have talked about is that in the future you're going to see a stronger concentration of forces, not on these sort of large gargantuan platforms, whether it's going to be on carriers or bases, but it's going to be more focused on the deployment of smaller troops deployments, whether it's going to be maybe at the platoon level, if not smaller. And then for the Navy, it'll be a stronger focus on, submarines, smaller craft like frigates and destroyers, rather than large carrier-based fleets, which has been sort of the modus operandi for the United States since, the 40s. That'll be something to definitely keep in mind. And the other thing too that that the Americans I think have been thinking about since the F-35 program started was thinking smaller. The F-35 is designed to land on much smaller versions of aircraft carriers than say what's being proposed out of the Gerald Ford. So I do think that we are going to see that peak in size and then retract, not in terms of maybe naval size, but maybe more smarter force projection, because you don't need to risk that much losses being in there. But as our resident naval officer will tell us, gargantuan ships though do leave to risk aversion, which means a more restraint kind of strategy. But they can also serve as like we talked about, like a fleet in being, because you don't want to take on something that large that can deploy that many aircraft or have a carrier group close by. Not to mention that attacking something that large is only going to incur a much larger amount of military and economic consequences.
Right. Because if we look at, say, the Pacific theater of World War II, aircraft carriers were relatively cheaper to produce. It's something like a decade to 13 years to build a carrier today. So because they're much more sophisticated, they're larger. You can't mass produce them like, popcorn like we did in World War II. So that kind of strategy is going to be somewhat different. I think what would also facilitate smaller deployments is with the rise of automated drones and automated planes, any sort of like carrier platform, because it's unmanned, or at least the power projection element is unmanned, could be much, much smaller than an aircraft carrier today and still maintain. I mean, the ship would still have to have humans operating it, but the actual deployment platforms would be essentially robots. And you could have a much, much smaller platform that way.
And speaking of which, I brought our resident naval officer to come on board. So, hi, Mr. Mandrill. How are you? If he can get his mic working, but if not, we'll just keep going. But one of the things that I also wanted to mention is that we talked. Oh, there he goes. We were talking earlier about the concept of the fact that the sea have a place to retrench.
I'm doing very well. How are you, gentlemen?
Hello.
Hello.
Glad that you're here. We can hear you. Don't worry.
Perfect.
Okay, cool. As I was saying, one of the things that I wanted to get your thoughts on, both of you, is that since Mahan and Corbett talk about the seas not being a place for you to really retrench, which is why Mahan is so focused on the island concept and having places to defend and have ports and to resupply, is that I wonder how much of naval strategy from Corbett and Mahan can be applicable to cyberspace, because it's not really a place that you can be retrenched in. I mean, there's servers that you can have, of course, but when dealing with foreign commerce and dealing with foreign trade, it's not like you can say this is explicitly ours in an open network system. The Chinese might have an advantage in this because they do have sort of their closed network, their great firewall of China, as it's been described. I just think that I wonder that the digital space might be a place to see somewhat of these tactics being transliterated into a different front.
Well, as far as, say, cyberspace and, to what extent it's applicable to the insights and theories of Mahan and Corbett. Now, obviously, a lot of the quote-unquote economic activity, the transactional aspect, still occurs on these computer platforms. But there's still the in real life physical container ships that transport all of these goods and services that these computer code represents. And so to the extent you can still attack that and can still constrain that, it has an effect. Now, will it have the effect of the same degree that it did 200 years ago when you did this? That's an open question. And then to what extent would quote unquote cyber war follow rules, anything like what we see here? Now, I'm not really knowledgeable on cyber war or computers in that regard, so I can't really say.
Yeah, and I can't really say on cyber warfare either. That's not my area of expertise at all, so unfortunately I can't give you a take.
But real quick, one thing I would want to add, though, you mentioned the whole importance of naval bases. Yes, but that is why we developed nuclear-powered aircraft carriers and nuclear-powered submarines, because now the United States, as a result of decolonization of the French and the British, in which case some of those colonies went to the Reds, we still wanted to deploy naval power. And so what's interesting is how technology changes this rule. With the development of nuclear power, you could have, I think, ideally, the USS Gerald Ford would only have to be refueled once in its entire lifetime. So the idea being now that we have a whole different set of conditions now where controlling these land spaces, I wouldn't say it's irrelevant, but it's much less important than it was in Mahan's day.
I think it does kind of go back to, if you want to control space, you're going to have land forces on there. I mean, it's great for trade to, have access to ports. That's always going to be necessary. But I mean, we take a look at countries that we probably have stronger ties with, or at least we can use our wealth, as Mahan puts it, to exert influence. I mean, it would require a U.S. presence. Like the polls are a really great example right now, with over the last 4 years between now this administration and Trump, about our land forces on there and our political leverage on the country, not to mention with military exports as well. But Mandrill, since you're on, is there anything that we've mentioned in the last hour that you wanted to comment on or quip to? Because of course you did serve in the Navy, so I was just curious what your thoughts may be on this overall.
Yeah, I would just briefly state that I would entirely agree with Preza Folly's assertion here that gargantuanism is a massive problem. For example, I think if you were to do some research onto the Russian platforms specifically, well, I think the Chinese also have it too. I mean, they cross over so much. But the Tarantul class patrol craft is definitely something to look into. Since it's basically like a 150, 200-foot vessel with anti-ship cruise missiles. And just going back to that concept where you can actually build things to have them be blown up, I guess, is probably a very smart strategy in the long run, just because your time of construction and the amount of assets that you can put into the battle space will be increased by a lot. So yes, I think you'll probably see a decrease in the amount of assets that have extremely high capabilities, and an increase in assets that have lower capabilities. My theory on this is actually that you'll have like a two-tiered system, right? So you'll have a very small subset of assets that are extremely highly capable, but then you'll have a larger core of every single type of asset like air or ships or submarines or whatever that is like much less in terms of capability, but is still able to get its functional job done, and can be expendable. So there's an interesting book that I would like to refer everybody to. It's called I think it's 100 Days. It's the book on the Falklands by Admiral Sandy Woodward, and you can kind of see what I'm talking about here. The Argentinians only started that conflict with about 4 Exocet missiles, I believe, in their entire inventory. So what they had to do is they had to utilize old F-4 Phantoms with bombs strapped to them, and just basically fly the flight pattern of a guided missile using a plane with a bomb on it. So, I mean, of course, it's incredibly risky to do that because every plane is now subjected to air defense systems and all that. But it isn't an effective tactic to do that. So if you're somebody where, like, for example, we see in the modern conflict in Crimea, Russia has spent, I think, hundreds of guided missiles. Well, you only have so many in your inventory, and that gets depleted relatively quickly. So the course of warfare that you're going to see with guided missiles is going to look something like a short, high-intensity bombardment with guided munitions and aircraft strikes, using standoff distances in order to take out C2 radars, anti-air systems, et cetera, and then you move on to other things where they have, more assets that can be expendable. So like in the modern context, we'd see things like Harriers or Su-24 Frogfoots that are basically very cheap, inexpensive, or A-10 Warthogs in our case, where those assets can be expendable, whereas the other high-intensity assets, you use them in the beginning of the conflict and in the decisive moment of the conflict where you want to deal damage. But in all other cases, you would much prefer to attrite the enemy's forces.
Well, one thing that I think is sort of related to that is when we talk about the changing nature of technology in naval warfare, we didn't really get to see this because these were essentially late Cold War developments by the Soviet Union. But with the Oscar submarine, which was a platform that could launch anti-ship missiles while underwater, and then launching these volleys of anti-ship missiles to attack NATO convoys. They also had destroyer and cruiser platforms that could do similar things. To what extent, with the advances in missile technology, especially with regards to speed, hypersonic missiles, will we see these vessels, which are relatively cheap to produce, and can, again, Aegis has, again, it's a secret, but it has some limit at which you can't track or stop missiles beyond a certain point, and you just saturate the system with these relatively cheap missiles and these relatively cheap delivery platforms. To what extent that's going to change naval warfare?
Yes, and you can see that very clearly with the weapons that China and Russia currently have, right? Everybody has some, like, think of an anti-ship cruise missile almost like a bullet, right? It's ammunition. So when you're spending a whole bunch of money on an incredibly capable platform that it has the ability to avoid, or a near ability to almost nearly avoid almost every single anti-air missile defense, that's an incredibly expensive bullet, right? So if I was to give you an example, I think it's the SSN-19 is a pretty interesting one that you can look up on Wikipedia, which has some interesting things. But mostly the more modern platforms are bog standard, like active seeker cruise missiles with like medium range. So things like the Exocet, like the Harpoon, like the Charlie A803, or alternatively called the YJ83. These are all missile systems that all have somewhere around 60 to 100 miles range, with a couple 100-kilo warhead. Everybody, with an active seeker, of course, everybody has a variant of this, essentially. This is like your bog standard bullet. And so since everybody has the same thing, right, and I forgot to mention, most of those missiles are all subsonic as well. So they're not really designed to penetrate the system, they're designed to be cheap and to be expended in volume. And eventually one of them is going to get in through those defenses. So it really does come down to the old fight between weapons and armor. And what happens if I have a weapon that if I just, firepower wins, right? So if I just shoot more weapons at you, then you're likely going to get through the defenses somehow.
Well, also, too, with the rise of supercavitating torpedoes, which would make submarines far more lethal, might we see the return of essentially, for lack of a better word, the torpedo boat? A small Corvette-style platforms that can just launch these ridiculously fast torpedoes and then run away. Kind of like Parthian tactics in the sea.
I think you said he had to take a moment there, Praise. We might have to wait a minute there.
But, at least for that point.
Yeah, right. But I think that this is, as we look at this now, I think we cannot begin to just understate how important Mahan and also his British contemporary are still used today in our understanding of these kind of aspects of naval warfare, but also the application of grand strategy, because the Navy is integral to it. These things are standing institutions, and our aspect of trade, like you had mentioned, Praise, as much as we look at things financially on a ledger, we do have, cargo ships and containers that are out there that we have to pay in mind for. I think what's interesting is to see, the Navy isn't particularly from what I understand, a naval deployment, right, has been the issue of its bog standard, go out, deploy carrier groups, continue normal operations. But I haven't seen too much in regards to our ongoing supply chain issues, which might illustrate, of course, how much influence the Navy can have in regards to dealing with, say, China doing a lockdown in the Shanghai area, which is a major export region primarily for electronics and manufactured computer equipment, that's now not being sent out. So it's very hard now to sort of pull the old form of gunboat diplomacy when other nations have equally standing navies, or they can just simply not play the globalized trade game.
Well, I mean, that is a good point, right? So this is what I like to say about China. The last time the United States was in a force-on-force conflict with China, it was in Korea. And China inflicted on us the longest retreat of any U.S. force in history. We retreated from the Yalu River to south of Seoul. That's why Korea is the forgotten war. The Americans got such a beatdown by the Chinese that we just blocked it from our memory. I mean, we like to tell these stories that we just stop all of our enemies. And then when we signed the treaty, the armistice, I think it was Ridgway, who was commander of the UN forces at the time, said this was atrocious. He said this is the first time the United States didn't win a war. That's what Ridgway said. So if China could inflict such a humiliation in 1950, when we were the most technologically advanced military in the world, and they just had machine guns, mortars, and rice balls, and now they have a comparative parity in land, sea, and air capabilities, I don't think it's going to work out too well.
The counterpoint I hear a lot from that would be the military, unlike 1950, right? Because this is just coming out of kicking out Chiang Kai-shek and fighting against the Japanese and their own internal conflict for the last decade. Is that the modern Chinese Navy is not necessarily as battle tested in terms of state to state conflict. The last time that it had engaged with the military in that kind of context after the Korean War was really its battle of Vietnam in the 1970s. And its war in 1979, China had lost to Vietnam. It considered it a cultural victory, but I would think that the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution had gutted, at the time, at least, the doctrines and standards of the Chinese military.
Right. I guess what I would say as in response is that the United States has not been engaged in a force-on-force conflict for 30 years. I think what we're beginning to see is the overcommitment to guerrilla warfare has left us inadequate in certain regards in dealing with a force-on-force conflict.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of that at play here, that a lot of these great power like states, Russia, China, the United States, we've been dealing with insurgencies, whether it's, say, against the Chechens or dealing with South Ossetia or fighting in Azerbaijan with special forces advisors, or us in Afghanistan, or the Chinese dealing with counterterrorism operations in eastern provinces or western provinces. I think that's also why a lot of people got really surprised, outside of a few scholars, that about the losses that the Russians were taking in Ukraine, because this is the first time we're seeing traditional state-on-state conflict, and the first time in decades. So that's something I think that is definitely true to examine when we take a look at future conflict. And I mean, everyone is green. Steve points out there hasn't been a major naval war in decades. So that'll be something to look at in the near future.
Yeah,
One thing I
correct.
wanted to ask you, Mandrill, before you had to leave.
No,
with
I'm
the rise
back.
of the-
I'm back. I had to grab lunch real quick, and it was burning on the stove. So there will be no further interruptions, thankfully.
with the rise of supercavitating torpedoes, which I think are a real game changer, I think we might see the revival of, essentially, for lack of a better word, PT boats, Corvette-style craft that can pursue a kind of Parthian shot technique where they sail up, launch a salvo of supercavitating torpedoes and then peel away. I think that's such a decisive weapon that it might be deployed in that way.
Sorry, I missed the question there. Somebody was knocking on my door. I said there was no further interruptions, and then I immediately get interrupted. So apologies.
Okay, so supercavitating torpedoes. Basically you can go supersonic speeds underwater with a torpedo. With something that powerful, which seems to be and being perfected by the Russians and the Chinese, might we see a revival of PT boats, Corvette-style craft that do a sort of Parthian shot at an enemy fleet and then, fire off their salvo and peel away?
Yes, actually, and you will definitely see that, especially with countries like Iran, although Iran doesn't actually use, to my knowledge, guided torpedoes. I think that mostly they're low tech, right? So they're using things that are just traditional straight running torpedoes, especially on their small craft. So, I mean, but that's just in keeping with what I said before about an asset which has just enough capability to inflict damage, but is extremely inexpensive, and therefore is essentially an asset that you can afford to be destroyed.
I also think one more new technology that might make the big gun ships come back is railguns. One of the problems with railguns on land warfare is because they're electromagnetic, they need tremendous amounts of energy in order to fire, which, for a land platform is going to be a little harder to generate. But if you're a warship, especially a nuclear-powered warship, that would be no problem at all. And so what, if any, would be the results of the deployment of railguns? Might it lead to a revival of big gun ships?
I would say that the major problem with railguns is going to be the power capacity of any ship you're equipping it with. Railguns take an incredible amount of electrical power. So essentially the only assets that you're going to be able to equip this weapons system on is going to be a nuclear one. The amount of expertise and depending on what country you are, the amount of nuclear material available to you is going to vary. And especially if, again, like I mentioned before, the type of asset where you can afford to lose it. Like diesel engines, most gas turbine engines, which are what the DDGs and the cruisers are in the United States military currently have, and the amphib platforms usually have diesels, but those are generators that are like relatively cheap. They're relatively reliable. They're not, super sophisticated, so you can train like the average person in how they work and how they function. These are all the sorts of logistical requirements that you would have to meet in order to have railguns as an effective weapons platform. So I just think as of right now, it's kind of outside of the realm of possibility until you actually have a navy that meets those requirements.
Well, we appreciate your insight here at the end. But as we get to the 90-minute mark, Mr. Mandrill, Praise of Folly, is there anything that you would like to shill or let your audience know about?
Well, I'll just say, check out the Praise of Folly podcast. It's a great podcast. For supporting the channel and for getting regular updates, check out my locals. And I guess the last thing I'll say is, I think if we look at naval warfare today and the trends, I have a very strong suspicion or intuition that people who say aircraft carriers can't get sunk, especially in light of the missile development, are going to be in a very similar fix as the people that said battleships couldn't be sunk by airplanes, and then World War II happened. I feel like there's a kind of rhyming effect going on right here.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. And as I've said before, just now, it's armor versus weapons, and that is a dynamic which has lasted throughout the entire centuries of warfare. So, I mean, it never ends.
Yeah, and I mean, we're going to continue to see the evolution of warfare play out, and we're seeing sort of the beginning of the flexing of new weapons in the 21st century. So I think that both of you are very right on this point. But I'm just going to get to these 2 super chats real quick, and then we can wrap up here for this evening. Monothalmos said for €5, he said, my copy of The Influence of Sea Power Upon History used to belong to Admiral von Trippetz, and it has his signature, which is a really unique little piece of that's a collectible. I would keep that and hold on to it. And then Vingul had said for 5 krona, for a fantastic novel set in the Age of Sail, the Aubrey Maturin series by Patrick O'Brien, Master and Commander. That's where the film is based on the first few of those books. I cannot recommend them enough. I highly recommend that you do. They're a great piece of fiction and a really historically accurate as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to just provide a little slideshow here. We'll get to some announcements and head on to just take some questions if there's some time. But let me go share screen real quick. Chrome tab, share audio. And yeah, here we go. Share. If it'll let me do it. There we go. Slideshow. Alrighty. So, if you might have noticed on Twitter, I did a little quick appearance with Pete Kionis not too long ago. This yesterday actually, and recorded. It'll be out Wednesday for you all to enjoy. I have another fishing video out, and then there's one on the subject of neats coming out soon. And then, of course, if you didn't attend the U.S. Shieldings event, patrons have access to my event speech. And I've sent a few DMs out. I'm kind of working on some interviews with some rather IR scholars to talk to, so that'll be happening. And then Praise of Folly will be joining me hopefully sometime this month with Charlemagne and EG to discuss BreadTube Serves Imperialism. So if you want homework, go over to Praise of Folly's channel. All the links are in the description, and you can see his interview with Caleb Malpin on that subject. So go check him out. Go subscribe to him. His History of Warfare series, I think, is just as good as some of the stuff AM has put out. But, I mean, his stuff is explicitly on warfare, so go watch it and enjoy it because that stuff is really good. But since it's the end here, I'm going to get on to just shilling and whatnot. Praise, Mandrill, you two are free to leave. If not, we can just stay for Frog of the Week and a little bit of shilling.
I do have one thing I'd like to show. So obviously I do have a Substack, and yeah, I do have a Substack, and my YouTube channel is growing ever so slowly. I do have a video that I would like to shill in the works, which is about the pagan symbolism that is in the recent 2021 Dune movie. So if you're interested in that, please subscribe to my channel and check it out when it comes out.
One thing I'll say is at the end of the month, the last Thursday of the month, I have an interview scheduled with James Kunstler, author of The Long Emergency, Too Much Magic, and Living in the Long Emergency.
All right. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much. If you want to stick on, I'm just going to do the usual Frog of the Week thing when I conclude with my show. But if not, you two are more than free to let you go. You don't have to stay for this part.
No, I'll stay for Frog of the Week. It's the best part of the stream.
Fantastic. All right. Well, then we'll move on. All right, now that that's out of the way, thank you so much for Cyberpunk Internal Affairs for the music. Our lovely Frog of the Week this time is the Japanese wrinkled frog, native to Japan, however, was introduced to Hawaii in the late 19th century, primarily courtesy to the Americans. It is light green, primarily is one of the species of true frog, the most dominant kind of frog family out within the type of frogs that are out there in the world. And it's known for its rough and uneven skin all over its body, hence the name. And they will warn you if you've ever visited Hawaii or if you've been deployed there that they are very poisonous to dogs and children alike. So do not touch them or lick them. You will not get high. You will die. And they are a freshwater animal, primarily around sea level amphibians, and they mate and spawn around this time frame, April, May. You can see them in shallow waters, so streams, rice pads, ponds, and about 4 to 6 centimeters in length, the females being the largest, and you have a lovely picture right there. So that's this week's Frog of the Week, and we'll just catch up with all of you all for a little bit of questions. And again, thank you to the top tier patrons that are listed here. Mr. Mandrill is one of them. These gentlemen donate $20 and more a month on my Subscribe Star, link in the description. And yeah, gentlemen, you guys have been fantastic. And in these discussions, praise. I love it when you come on. You're such a wealth of historical knowledge, more than myself.
Hello?
And I'm very thankful for that.
I'm sorry, you cut out. Could you repeat that, please?
Oh, I said, no, I'm always happy when you come on because you're such a wealth of historical knowledge that I don't always have. So you're just like the perfect complement for whatever subject we talk about.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. And we both have the same interest in broader strategic thought and policy and analysis.
Yeah. I do think, like we've been talking in the past, that we'll probably do more stuff together in the future for that, for sure. But yeah, ladies and gentlemen, for all of you in the chat, you guys have been fantastic. You guys have been pointing out some good technical stuff in the comments that I've shown on screen. So thank you all so much. Mr. Mandrill, I will add your link in the description as well, since you came on here at the end. But I hope everyone has a great rest of their Sunday, and you all take care, and we'll see you next time.